Just a double
We can
check.
see it, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So, yeah, good day again. My name is Ina Lietaert. I'm assistant professor at UNU-CRIS, the United Nations University CRIS in Bruges. And together with Katie Kuschminder and all of the contributors to this webinar, I'm very happy to present to you the special issue we are launching in the journal International Migration. So what we want to do today is actually present to you this special issue. I will start with a short rationale of the special issue, followed by the separate presenters who will present the context of their study and the research results, of course, before ending with some conclusions and the conclusions on the core focus of this issue, and that is the need for a further conceptualization and contextualization of the concept of reintegration. But first, like I said, some more insights on the rationale of the special issue. So, as all of you know, research on reintegration has significantly increased over the past decades. It has widened our understanding of the meaning and the processes of returnees' experiences of reintegration. And we understand reintegration as the processes of establishing or re-establishing the social, economic, legal, and emotional ties that define a person as a member of a community after the person was a certain time away from this place. And in the context of this research and this webinar, this time away was, of course, in the context of migration. So it's widely acknowledged nowadays that reintegration is challenging, it's multidimensional, it's long-lasting, and it's a highly contextualized process. These challenges are documented by many researchers already, challenges of different types of returnees. It's the multidimensionality as well. So the multidimensionality of reintegration processes, as different researchers have illustrated how it takes place across different dimensions. In many studies, they focus on the material or economic domain, which is mainly investigated through livelihood and housing, but also the social cultural domain, investigated through access to social networks and social cultural organizations, the psychosocial domain, investigated through returnees' mental health or their feelings of identity and belonging, and the political and legal domain, investigated through feelings of safety and trust in government. So all these domains have a very important role to play, yet they are included into research in various combinations and with different operationalizations. So, and the third point is the long-lasting and the non-linear character of reintegration. All these adjectives just stress once more that reintegration is a process. It's not linear. It's always subjected to evolution and to change. What makes its outcome, or to say its duration, also subjected to change. And all these elements together strongly highlight its complexity. Of course, all social processes are highly complex and multifaceted, and this is certainly the case for reintegration processes as well, where its multidimensionality and the fact that there are so many factors impacting reintegration create very different post-return realities. And I'll give a short overview of the influencing factors. So many research have pointed at the individual characteristics of the returnees, but also the social and the cultural expectations surrounding return processes, the willingness and the readiness of people to return, and the situation of people and the situation which people are confronted with in the host countries and the countries of return, and equally the situations they are confronted with during their migration trajectory, which several of our contributors will stress in this webinar. So this complexity has been highlighted by several researchers as a strong rejection of a simplistic, reduced, or one-sided pessimistic or one-sided rosy-colored understanding of reintegration and its meaning and its outcome. However, we do argue that despite this added value of all these insights, still a lot of work is need to be done to get more insight in the contextualization of reintegration, because the word, the processes, its meaning, it differs in different locations and might lead to different understanding of what is happening. And at the same time, the complexity, everybody recognizes its complexity, yet much more work is needed to disentangle this complexity and fully understand the mechanisms that are at play when people return and reintegrate. So this is what this special issue aims to do, aims to increase understanding of reintegration processes, to avoid placing returnees in a context of high vulnerability or heightened vulnerability or accumulated vulnerabilities, yet instead work towards enabling environments for successful reintegration. All the contributors to the special issue focus on reintegration processes of migrants that do not have a legal right to stay in the country of destination. That's a very particular subgroup within the huge variety of return mobilities. Yet this lack of legal status abroad often, not always of course, but often implies that people return with few resources, often to post-return contexts with challenging economic conditions, challenging access to services and resources, and even realistic security threats. So all this makes reintegration de facto challenging for this group. Yet let us have a look to the different contributions of today. So first we will hear Marie-Laurence Flahaux, who focuses on a new conceptual framework for reintegration, linking the intentions and realizations of return with reintegration processes of Senegalese and Congolese return migrants. Then we go to the article of Yajaira, Ceciliano-Navarro, and Tanya Golash-Boza. The two authors focus on the impact of psychological, social, and human capital on labor market reintegration of Dominican deportees from the United States. Then we go to Nassim Majidi, who focused on community dynamics and the access of assisted returns to different levels of social support. And then we listen to Katie Kuschminder, who will join the results of two articles that are in the special issue, who both focus on forced return to Ethiopia. So the first is written by Ashinafi Tizazu and investigates the specific meaning of reintegration in the context of rural Ethiopia. And her own paper, together with Zoe and Iman, focuses on the subjective evaluations of the same group of Ethiopian returnees having been deported from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So finally, I will add some insights of my own paper examining reintegration in Georgia and Armenia through the analytic lens of well-being. So all these papers together bring different methodological approaches. Both quantitative and qualitative data are merged together. Some data is collected from practices with international agencies, with non-governmental organizations, and other data is from large academic surveys and ethnographic studies. And together we try to cover a wide geographical area, presenting empirical cases from Afghanistan, Armenia, the Dominican Republic, DRC Congo, Ethiopia, Georgia, and Senegal. So that's quite a list already. So here you have the overview of the titles. I won't repeat them, but instead go to the first presenter, which is Marie-Laurence Flahaux. She's a researcher at the French National Research Institute for Sustainable Development, which is based in Marseille. Her background is in demography, and she uses mixed methods to investigate the patterns and drivers of migration, return migration, and the effects of migration policies, and particularly focuses on the African context. Marie-Laurence, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm taking my presentation. So thank you first. Thank you very much, Ina and Katie, to coordinate this special issue and also for organizing this event today. First, so this is the title. My paper is entitled Reintegration After Return, Conceptualization and Empirical Evidence from the Life Course of Senegalese and Congolese Migrants. First, I would like to define reintegration. So in my article and in this presentation, reintegration is defined as a process taking place after return. So when returned migrants have to find their place in the society of their origin country. The starting point of my article is that in the literature, in the theoretical and empirical literature, research on reintegration after return is often disconnected from research on the intention to return and on the realization of return. So those topics are analyzed as separate matters. And there is a lack of studies taking into account the life course of migrants and their long-term life aspirations. So my contribution in this article is to study the reintegration process of returned migrants through the lens of individual life trajectories. So in an approach that takes into consideration both the migrants' return intentions and the returns itself. So the idea actually is that the issue of reintegration of migrants in their origin country is important through the trajectories of migrants and not only after their return. So I propose a conceptual framework and I apply this framework to the case of Senegalese and Congolese migrants to Europe. So this arrow, so for the conceptual framework first, this arrow represents the life course of migrants so since they migrated. And reintegration happens after their return. And aspirations and external factors are very important factors for their reintegration. So the aspiration, it refers to what migrants consider as the best for them and for their family. And the external factors is the context in the origin country, of course, but can be related to the context in the destination country and the family context as well. So the condition of return, so the condition in which the circumstances in which return happens has a strong influence on the reintegration process. So it has been shown in the literature already. But what I want to add here is that the way how migrants anticipate their reintegration when they are abroad in the country of destination, it also has a very important effect on the realization of return, on the decision to return or not. And at each stage, the importance, so aspirations and external factors play a role, so influence each of these events or phenomena. So I use a mixed method approach and I studied the case of Senegalese and Congolese migrants who migrated to Europe and stayed there for at least 1 year. Some of them returned and some other didn't return. And I use quantitative data and qualitative data. So the quantitative data come from the biographical surveys of the migration between Africa and Europe project, the MAFE project. And the qualitative data are interviews that I carried out with returnees in Dakar and Kinshasa. Now I would like to focus on the main results. The first main result is that migrants anticipate their reintegration. So the empirical analysis revealed that. First, on arrival in Europe, migrants have the intention of returning to Senegal and Congo if they know that they will have access to good opportunities there. So migrants anticipate that. For example, we see in the quantitative analysis that migrants from Congo and Senegal, when they left their country to study in Europe, they have about an 80% chance of intending to return. So this is the case of Gustave, he's a Congolese. He went to Belgium to get his PhD, and he said that the idea was to leave, write a doctoral thesis, and come back as a professor and civil servant. So from the beginning, his initial intention was to return because he knew that his reintegration would be smooth because he would get a position as a professor and civil servant. He had already the certitude that he would have that. And during the stay abroad, migrants can change their mind about returning because they continue to anticipate their future reintegration if they return. So actually we see that the Senegalese who left to study, they have indeed a high chance of returning, but actually not the Congolese, because Congolese, so they don't seem to be more likely to return. Because they are aware of the economic and political instability in Congo, and they know that they will make their reintegration difficult. So some of them choose finally not to risk returning, while they had the intention at the beginning to return. So yeah, a Congolese interviewee, so Aristide, he said that actually when he left, he did not think that he was leaving for good. He said, for me, at first, it was the chance for me to study, to train. But in the meantime, back home, so thinking of home, things did get worse. So actually, he didn't want to return. He didn't have the intention to return. But in the end, he had to return for administrative reason, and that's how I met him. But it changed his mind during his stay in Europe. The second big main result is that when migrants have the intention of returning, they prepare for their return. So this is not surprising. They acquire the financial capital, the human capital. But another aspect of the preparation is to ensure that they will be able to live again after the return if they need to. So a possibility is to become a national of a European country. It will allow them to come back to that country if their reintegration in their home country in Africa does not go well. Flahaux is a Senegalese, and so he decided to return to Senegal to open his own concert hall in Dakar. And he said that actually he chose to come back because he knew that if it wouldn't go well, he would have the possibility to live again and to go back to France, because actually he has the French citizenship. He says, I really want to try, because in any case, I am French, so I can come to Senegal. I love my country, I make an effort, but I know that I can always go back to France and continue my career there. So the fact that he had the possibility to go to Senegal temporarily was a big part of in his decision to return. So the preparation in brief, the preparation is important, not only to maximize the chance of successful reintegration in Senegal and Congo, but also to have the possibility to migrate again in case of difficulty. The third main result, and this is the last, is that the way reintegration takes place, it depends on its preparation. When migrants plan for their reintegration before returning, and when they prepare their return, they are more likely to be satisfied with their return. But for those who had not prepared sufficiently their return, of course, they experience difficulties after their return for their reintegration. This is interesting to see that Senegalese migrants, when they return, well, when they intended to stay in Europe for good, when they left, so first they left Senegal and they had in mind, okay, I want to leave Senegal for forever. So they didn't have the intention to return, but because of an external factor, an external circumstance, they had to return. Actually, in the quantitative results, we see that they have a high chance of re-migrating to Europe. So I think that it's very interesting. So in conclusion, you saw that the results are consistent with the conceptual framework, and that the phenomena of initial intention, return, and reintegration, they are clearly interconnected. From the start of migration, migrant anticipates their eventual reintegration. During the migration, if they want to return, they will prepare their return so that they will achieve the optimal condition for reintegration. And upon return, reintegration will depend on the planning, on their preparation, the preparation they did beforehand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie-Laurence. I will give the floor to our next presenter then, who is Yajaira Ceciliano-Navarro. She's a PhD candidate at the Department of Sociology at the University of California. She has a master's degree in labor psychology, and she has been researching reintegration of deportees after their removal in different contexts, and recently focuses on the punitive policies and deportation, the impact that this has on families and communities.
Hello, I just want to check that everyone can see my presentation here.
We see your presentation is just not in the full presentation mode. So if you could make it full.
It's not yet?
We see it, but it's very small because it's not in presentation mode. That's already.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah. Yajaira, you could or reduce the space for the notes, so to reduce it, or to in the right side.
Okay, see.
Yeah, that's already something. Okay.
Now?
Yes, if you could click the right on the bottom at the right, you can click on presentation mode, but if not, it's already visible.
I don't know if here, yeah.
At the top, if you click on view, like next to review, click on view right there. And then, yeah, view, and then presenter, I mean, what is it?
Normal. It should be normal.
Oh, where is presenter? Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, that's why a presenter view, I don't know.
Okay, well, we could see it fine. Can you click on the far right? See that little X in the corner where you can move away the screen on the right so we can see it better?
It should be here, but I don't know why.
It's not there. Okay. That's fine. That's perfect.
Yeah, fine.
Or maybe here, maybe I can make it bigger. It should be here because I can see it.
But you see where it says play from start up on the right, on the top corner, it says under home, it says play from start right there. Yeah, click that button.
Okay, I did it. Now it's good.
No,
no,
because you didn't click that button, but it's okay. We can still see it.
It's okay. We can see it.
And well, I hope. That's so weird. I can see it like presenter view, but okay, I can start right now.
Yes, yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for organizing this webinar, and thanks for the also the publication. This article. I have been working on the topic of deportations with the professor Tanya Golash-Boza. So the title of this presentation is Social, Human, and Positive Psychological Capital in the Labor Market Reintegration of People Deported to the Dominican Republic. So what we found in the literature review is the numbers about the amount of people deported from the USA to other countries. We have that more than 6 million people have been deported from the United States since 1996. The Dominican Republic is one of the top 10 countries to which deportees are sent. Also, we find that most of the scholarship of research on deportations have been focusing on the challenges that deportees face post-deportation. Some of these studies have been studying the role of social, human, and financial capital. And Also, these studies have been focusing on structural barriers rather than what makes reintegration possible. Since we are focusing on social, human, and psychological capital, I am going over these concepts very quick. We all know the meaning or what entails social capital. We understand it as the benefits that we can obtain through networks or relationships. The human capital includes education, qualifications, habits, training, work experience, health, ideas, information, and knowledge that allow a person to be productive or secure employment. And positive psychological capital help us to understand how some people achieve their maximal human potential. And this approach focuses on dimensions such as self-efficacy, optimism, hope, and resilience, also on strengths, health, and vitality rather than weakness, illness, or pathologies. Therefore, in this study, in drawing from 60 in-depth interviews with Dominican deportees, we analyzed the role of human, social, and psychological capital. Just to have an idea of the profile of these people, we have 60 interviews. Most of them have children in the USA. The average time that they lived in the USA was around 16 years. And as we can see, some information about the schooling or education that they have is mostly primary education, 70%, while only 26% of them have some secondary education. So regarding the findings, we have here the social and human capital. I'm going to refer very quick to these two dimensions. As we can see that most of them, their family members, they are still in the United States. So when they go back to the Dominican Republic, they have few relatives, few friends. Therefore, their social capital is still a fracture. For them, it's very difficult to go back to a country where they don't know some people that maybe can help them to reintegrate. Regarding the human capital, as I was showing you, they have few education, few training. The job experience that they have sometimes don't match with the job experience that is required in the Dominican Republic. And here what we have is that deportees' socioeconomic background and experiences of immigration shape their social, human, and psychological capital. Due to the early immigration, many deportees see their social relations fractured, but also their education and training opportunities truncated. Later in life, their psychological capital is threatened by the pain caused by deportation. Even when human capital is limited and social capital is fractured, positive psychological capital play an essential role since it allows deportees to imagine different scenarios in which they can survive after deportation. And here I am going to refer very quick to the positive psychological capital of deportees. Although the scholars report depression and in some cases alcohol and drug abuse in deported people, we found that in our testimonies, deportees, the combination that they show of work and family, they express positive psychological capital, such as resilience, optimism, and faith. For deportees, their biggest cause of suffering is the separation from their children and the lack of resources to be able to fulfill the provider role. Deportees' positive psychological capital materializes when, despite all the suffering caused by deportation, they can still visualize themselves in better conditions through a job which gives them a sense of self-resilience and social connection. Here, I just wanted to show you very quick a testimony of one of the deportees. Danny has been in the Dominican Republic for 15 years. since he got deported. All his brothers and kids and wife, they are still in the United States. He lived there for 10 years, and he's still a very young person. He says that he said, you have to look for a future to improve. It's a calculation of progress. You cannot think like, well, he said something that he said, yesterday I had 1,000 pesos and I spent it. You have to say, good, tomorrow I am going to get 3,000. You cannot be close in a circle because you are going to be stuck. For him, he was always mentioning this idea to move on despite all the negative and adverse situation that he has been facing for 15 years in the Dominican Republic, and being not able to see his family and not even to have any option to reunite with them. So in conclusion, many deportees have lineage, fracture, and weak forms of capital, which limits their reintegration. While human capital is limited and social capital is quite fractured, positive psychological capital is an indispensable source of support to reinvent themselves after deportation. Their resilient optimism, efficiency, and faith permit them to search for jobs that, even when precarious, allow them to subsist and dream of a better future. Without positive psychological capital, many deportees will be in situations of depression and drug abuse. So thanks. This is the presentation. I think it's just on time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. After this presentation on the Dominican Republic, we move to Afghanistan with Nassim Majidi. Nassim is a research associate at Tufts University and Wits University. Nassim founded Samuel Hall 10 years ago, which is a social enterprise dedicated to migration research with offices in Kabul, Nairobi, Tunis, and Berlin. Nassim and her team are bringing valuable empirical insights in the study of return and reintegration, migration and displacement, which informs academia, policy, and programming.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ina. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And again, it's a lot of work and effort that went into this, mostly on Ina and Katie's part. So thank you to you. I've put a photo here of the first page of the article I'm going to speak about today. And the impetus for this article was really one of the recurring problems that I've seen in decisions to return or deport Afghans from Europe is the assumption by policymakers and courts that there's a community of return that Afghan migrants return to. So the decision on the return of Afghans from Europe are often based on the perceived support that Afghans will receive back home and that their social networks will provide. It shapes, as I mentioned, much of the decisions on asylum cases and on return. So the stakes are very high. And that is really what drove me to write this paper, to help change some of these decisions. Recent evidence on post-return outcomes show that migrant social networks may not provide them with the resources they need to reintegrate their country of origin. So I build on those past research to add on new findings. And I'll conclude, as you'll see, on the need to unpack what we mean by communities of return, which is a term that is often used in policy and programming circles. I focus on Afghanistan specifically because the context has really transitioned from a context of forced migration to one of forced returns. 1 million returns in 2016 alone, mostly from Iran and Pakistan, but also from Europe. But it's important to understand the scale and to also speak about all the different geographies of return to Afghanistan, because as much as the government of Afghanistan is investing in reintegration of refugee returnees from Pakistan or Iran, the conversation around migrant returns from Europe is completely set aside, and support is very limited, at least at the national policy level. So it remains a gap to be addressed. So what I've done for this research is I've looked into how studies on integration at destination points can help us reflect on what happens in reintegration. And so here, the theoretical framework for the paper is very much inspired by Ryan's work on the role of social networks in the UK, in the United Kingdom, in terms of integrating migrants arriving to the UK. Ryan, in her work, shows that the assumption that migrants have access to kin and friendship networks which facilitate integration needs to be questioned. So I take the same approach and show how that needs to be questioned upon return and reintegration as well. I look specifically at variables around trust and reciprocity that she uses to question whether these relationships exist at a quality level upon return in terms of people's interactions. I use here other tools that have been applied in human ecology. You see here an ecosystem model, which I've used to look specifically at the networks and at also the spatial links returnees have with their society. So looking beyond the microsystem of family and friends to understand what are the layers of relationships that they have. So these are some of the tools that I've used from other, from different disciplines to help inform my research. Beyond these questions of networks and quality of ties that bind people to their societies, I've also looked at using different tools in my interviews with returnees, visual tools, more participatory tools, where I ask them, and this is very much inspired by what NGOs are doing in Canada, integrating Syrian refugees. I looked at some of the tools that they were using and have been applying it over the last few years in reintegration contexts, where I've been asking returnees to basically situate their highs and lows of reintegration. So this is the W model, where they've been experiencing some of the lowest points in their social reintegration or their economic reintegration, as you can see on this slide, where they have experienced some of the highs. And so to understand that reintegration is this dynamic process. It's not a static linear process, but it's one that evolves across space and time. So I'm hoping that this paper can help also methodologically institutions and researchers think about tools that they can apply in their own work. And so I've used these tools across some research with IOM, with GIZ, and I'll give you some of those findings from the last few years of my research, integrating these spatial and temporal dimensions in the study of reintegration. And I'll focus, as you've heard before, on the different dimensions, so the economic, the social, and the psychosocial dimensions that we know are key to reintegration. And I link this back to the community network variables. Here on the economic side, what is key to understand is that in developing economies, the community connects individuals to jobs and supports economic reintegration. We know that. So social networks are essential to economic reintegration in settings where markets function improperly. Here in Afghanistan, the social networks are not necessarily professional networks that can connect returnees to jobs. And this is one of the key findings. The second is that in Afghanistan, expectations are actually on the returnee to provide for the community. In other terms, expectations are turned on returnees who are asked to provide material support or a return on investment for those who invested in their migration and who were left behind. So there are economic difficulties that the returnee faces that are due to debt, due to structural factors, but also due to the fact that not only the network does not facilitate the linkage with jobs, but the network actually expects material support from the returnee. So the tables are turned around on the returnee. It becomes time for returnees to give back to their communities after return, but they find it inherently difficult without an entry point in the labor market system. It becomes a catch-22 situation. Returnees often feel doomed for failure as a result, unable to meet the expectations put in front of them. And I'll take one example, Ahmed, who's a returnee who returned in 2016 from Sweden after spending 9 months there. His asylum case was denied and he returned. He was 31 at the time of his return. And he initially actually went and settled in a rural area, not an urban area, to avoid the high living costs and to be able to benefit from his close-knit social connections to find a job. But back in his village, close to some of his relatives, he quickly found out that he would not be able to count on his brother, who refused to lend him some money, but also that he was actually counting on working on his family's land, but his family's land was in the hand of the Taliban. So either he had to join them to work on the land and earn an income, or he couldn't earn any income. So it was very clear for him that he didn't really have many options in terms of economic reintegration. Now, tensions started arising. So that's obviously where, again, the question of expectations has an economic lens and a social one as well. His family refused to support him beyond a warm welcome in the initial phase, beyond encouraging him to return. After some time, he started fighting with his brother due to his lack of employment and financial problems, and creditors started coming knocking at his door. The role of the family here started to become very difficult for Ahmed, as the family would not basically accept to support him as a returnee. And this was a recurrent problem that we see in relations upon return to Afghanistan, which completely contradicts some of the theories around cultural networks and social networks in Afghanistan. And this really draws to a third point, which is the lack of compassion, empathy, and commitment to the returnee once he is back. And I say he, as most of my sample are actually men. And that is in and of itself a driver of remigration. So what I find in my research is that the lack of support network and economic support has a psychosocial repercussion. These perceptions of closed doors on the job market, at home, have repercussions in the way returnees feel upon return. So again, here, going back to Ahmed, he explains that some of his friends who returned as well went crazy, I quote him, after returning back to Afghanistan. Now he says, my psychological condition is not good. I am always alone. I keep to myself, away from society. So little by little, he's been keeping away from society, and he points that as the main driver for his remigration when we spoke to him in 2016. What conclusions we draw, and again, Ahmed's case is one case that I present in the paper, and there are other cases that I present, is the need to really unpack what we mean when we talk about community of return. There are increasing investments by donors, the European Union and others, in reintegration assistance at a community level. Again, we assume there's a community of return. I wrote this paper to show that we need to unpack what that concept is. As a community may simply not exist, or the community may have changed, or the community may simply be unable to act as a source of support for returnees from Europe specifically. Here I include a quote from Bowman, who explains in one of his books that community stands for the kind of world which is not, regrettably, available to us, but we would dearly wish to inhabit and which we hope to repossess. And this, for me, summarized very well the experience of returnees to Afghanistan in terms of their reintegration. And it's a reminder that assumptions must be challenged to end an imagined vision of the role of networks upon return. And there is really, from returnees' feedback, a price to pay upon return, not just of the failure of their migration or their dreams of migration, but also a loss of relationships, a loss of rights, a loss of freedom, and compromises that they have to make upon return. Communities ask what money and skills the returnee can contribute, whether the returnee can take care of the family's health, and whether the returnee will share their practices and beliefs. Oftentimes, returnees have a different answer than what those expected by community members. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nassim. Very clear presentation. Thank you. Then we go to the next presentation already. We will save all questions for the end. I am sorry that I didn't mention that before, but we will leave enough space for questions in general or to specific presenters totally at the end. And now we go to Katie Kuschminder, who will present who will summarize two papers on Ethiopia that are in the special issue. Katie Kuschminder is an assistant professor at UNU-MERIT and Maastricht University. Katie's research and teaching focuses mainly on return and reintegration, irregular migrant journeys, and migration governance. Katie has led many migration research projects for a variety of international organizations and national governments, and she leads or co-leads several large EU-funded projects focusing on migration governance. The floor is yours, Katie.
Thanks so much, Anna. Sorry for the delay there. So today I'm going to be presenting on two papers, as Anna said, and I think it's maybe also just good to mention that most of these papers are already available in early view on International Migration's website, and the last one from Ashanafi, Ilse Derlin, and Lietaert is coming, so it'll be there very briefly. But I will summarize today these two papers that both looked at return migration and reintegration in Ethiopia. So just to give a brief start on what's the context in Ethiopia, and also why, if we sort of had two papers focus on this. Ethiopia has been a country that has seen a lot of returns over the past 5 to 6 years. And this really started with mass deportations from Saudi Arabia in 2014. To give a little bit of brief background on the situation from Ethiopia, there are many drivers of migration, but two central ones are unemployment and underemployment. So underemployment, of course, being that even people who are employed, they might not be enough to make a living that is in any way sustainable. And this is a key challenge right now with inflation and rising costs of living in the country. There's a lot of documentation and there's a rich literature that shows that the conditions in Saudi Arabia are very challenging for both male and female Ethiopian migrants. And this makes it a very difficult migration experience for them. In 2014, then in Ethiopia, the mass deportations led to a humanitarian crisis and investments into the reintegration processes in the country, and several programs and international organizations became involved to offer different types of support to people returning for their reintegration processes. In the first paper that we worked on, which was myself with Zoe Ogahara and Iman Rajabzadeh, we looked at returnees' evaluations of their short-term return and reintegration within the context of this mass deportation. It was a quantitative analysis of over 2,000 surveys using the logic regression analysis. And these surveys were completed by the International Labour Organization, the ILO, to get an understanding of people's immediate reintegration experiences after they'd come back. So we're really looking at the short-term return here. We focused on a core question of the subjective evaluation of return. So we focused on the question that asked, at this point in time, how do you evaluate your return to your country of origin? And what was immediately quite surprising was that 45% of respondents said that they evaluated it positively, and 55% said that they evaluated it negatively or neutrally. And when you think about, of course, a forced return in a deportation context, and the previous presentation already today from our colleague Yajaira and Tanya, you can see that you would never expect in that type of a situation to have so many people say that their return was positive. So it's quite surprising within a deportation context to have 45% of respondents saying that their return was positive. We conducted a logic regression analysis to look at what were the factors that were then significantly correlated to this positive evaluation. And we found that there was a few variables that were quite significant. One was that respondents that had a better socioeconomic position prior to migration were more likely to have a negative evaluation of the return. And one of the reasons that we think this could be is that upon return, the respondents were unable to achieve their pre-migration conditions. So their situations of return were worse than when they had left beforehand. A second key finding was that people who had a better socioeconomic position abroad were more likely to have a more positive evaluation of the return. And we suspect that this is because even though experiences might have been challenged and that their situation was interrupted, that if they were able to gain skills or resources abroad, then of course this influenced their reintegration experience. And finally, we found that those who were self-employed upon return were much less likely to have a positive evaluation of their return. And this is suspected to be related to the fact that there was very low employment upon return across this group. And so if they were employed at all, then that would positively relate to the return experience. So our analysis shows that these different stages of the migration life cycle really have a significant impact on the evaluation of return. If I turn now to the second paper, it's really a nice complement because it looks at a qualitative analysis of life history interviews with 20 male returnees to a rural area in the Amhara region, all of whom had been forcibly returned from Saudi Arabia to Ethiopia. And what's really striking about these interviews is that people had migrated between 2 and 13 times. So quite a few times they had been within the same migration cycle. And the starting point of this piece is that there's insufficient attention has been paid to the different meanings of reintegration for the particular group of people returning to rural areas. So this article does begin with a systemic review of the concept of reintegration, and then it moves into these interviews. And the findings show that there's 2 core meanings of reintegration for these returnees. And the first one, we look at economic reintegration, looks at 3 elements of housing, the ownership of land and its productivity, and income generation. And what's really important here is that being able to make sustainable living is very important, of course, upon return. And it becomes very central. But the issue of income sufficiency, I think, is really nicely shown in the paper that relates back, I think, to this core issue of underemployment in Ethiopia. And that being able to just have land, if it wasn't productive enough due to drought and other conditions, it of course didn't create economic reintegration. And being able to generate income was, again, not sufficient if it wasn't at the right level, if it wasn't enough money to be able to make. And there's a really nice quote in this paper that says, one of the respondents said that now I have my house in the center and I started my own business, but the income is not sufficient to support my family. So even coming back and having a business and having employment is not enough. And that's a very common situation in Ethiopia that will often lead again to remigration. So it's important, I think, really to stress from this, the findings here. And a second core finding was the meaning of social reintegration for these returnees. How did they perceive it? And this was defined for the returnees as being about family and friendship relationships, participation in social events, and members in community-based organizations. And one of the parts here that I found myself particularly striking was the role of family relationships within the reintegration process. And one of the respondents here said, I thought that I could establish my own business with the money I had sent back, but unfortunately my parents had used it and even expected more from me. So the family expectations, of course, then relate very strongly into the reintegration process. So together, these papers contribute, I think, to this special issue by, first of all, contextualizing the reintegration experience and making it very clear that Ethiopia presents a unique context of a situation of mass forced returns where there's a large population of people returning quite quickly to the country. And the returnees to Ethiopia experience several reintegration challenges, but most prominently, these include the economic reintegration and income sufficiency. This is a critical issue that many returnees are really struggling with. At the same time, attitudes towards return are surprisingly positive for a deportation context. So this also creates several questions as to why it's so positive. And the most common reason that we can find for this is that the challenging situations in the Middle East, that even though return might not always be, might be very difficult, people are still happy to return to Ethiopia. And one of the findings that this also leads to is questioning the notions then again about the forced and voluntary return dichotomy, which has been very well argued by Marta Bivand-Erdel and Carrie Open in their paper on this in 2018, and bringing this back again into, of course, the return and reintegration experiences. And one of our arguments here is that although people are deported, sometimes they want to be deported, which creates a bit of an analytical dichotomy there between the forced and the voluntary, that they can also desire to be deported because the situations in Saudi Arabia had been so challenging. So this is an area that I think also needs further investigation, but it's something to think about as we contextualize this case. And finally, coming to this issue about conceptualizing reintegration, these papers together also really highlight the importance of subjective perceptions and incorporating further the perceptions of the returnees themselves into our analysis and discussions on the topic. The paper by Tazazu et al. Stresses the interrelatedness of different spheres of reintegration and really shows how, of course, again, it's very important to have these spheres interrelated. And the paper by myself and colleagues et al. Stresses the importance of the entire migration experience in influencing the reintegration experience and bringing all of these pieces together. And both of these papers consider this issue further of how to conceptualize reintegration when an initial integration did not exist, and the importance of migration drivers within the overall reintegration experience. So this is also something that I think Inna mentioned a little bit at the beginning, but is also quite important within the area of reintegration, is how to manage the topic of reintegration when an initial integration does not exist, and how can policies and programming then support people in this type of a difficult reintegration scenario. Thank you very much. And this is the end of the presentation, and I'll turn it back to you, Inna.
Thank you so much, Katie. Then we go to the final geographical location. Just a moment, I'll share my screen. So for this last part, I will finish with insights from my own research on reintegration processes in 2 countries in the Caucasus, that is Armenia and Georgia. To also give some context on these 2 countries. These are 2 countries with quite similar socio-economic and institutional contexts. It's a context characterized by a poor socioeconomic position and quite high unemployment rates. There is still quite some clientelism and corruption in different spheres, and actually strong barriers to set up a small-scale businesses, which is often the focus of reintegration programs. And there's an important element of unaffordable or unavailable healthcare. So all these elements importantly contributed to the contextual reasons of immigrations of the respondents of the study. And they were also important barriers for the reintegration processes. But at the same time, I need to stress that the respondents themselves also stresses the strength of their countries, the strength of unbreakable social ties, beautiful culture and heritage, and beautiful nature. So just want to add to what Katie also said, that or different positive elements in the return processes as well, which I will elaborate on a bit further. But as already indicated in the introduction of this webinar, the multidimensionality of reintegration and the many factors influencing the process, it has been extremely challenging to really capture what this means. It's difficult to bring together all the different processes that happen in the different spheres of reintegration. We know that a holistic view on reintegration is needed, but it remains quite hard to realize this in research. And I also believe it's quite problematic that a lot of research starts from a priori determined domains that are considered important for reintegration. Although standardized measurements are needed, they are very important to give overall overviews. I think they need to be preceded by or alternated by in-depth qualitative explorations of what exactly reintegration is and what would allow for diverging perspectives on well-being, and which will capture the contextual differences which the different presenters are referring to in this webinar. So in the paper that's in the special issue, I present the concept of well-being to study reintegration, with well-being understood as people's multidimensional evaluation of or their satisfaction with what they consider important, what they consider as important needs and goals for living well. So what is the value of working with this concept? It's that it actually shifts the attention to people's self-assessments of their post-return well-being and the components they themselves find important. And when you look at psychological literature on well-being, they stress a lot that people's subjective well-being results from simultaneous balancing of satisfactions of material needs and psychological needs. So it combines the two. And people's well-being, asking about people's well-being captures or summarizes a multitude of outcomes. So this is why I used the concept as a lens to look at reintegration and to try to fill some of the gaps or difficulties that reintegration research is confronted with. So how was it done? The paper is based on interviews, some semi-structured interviews with 65 assisted returnees, assisted to return from Belgium to Georgia and Armenia. And all respondents were interviewed twice, within the first year after return, and then again within the second year after return. And in the interviews, I, on the one hand, used open questions where we discussed the respondents' well-being. We just talked about their post-return lives and post-return well-being and the components that played an important role herein. And on the other hand, I used a well-being score. I asked people to score between 0 and 5 how well they would judge their lives, their satisfaction with their life in general, a bit to move away from the focus move away from the sole focus on migration experiences, but look at the current life at the moment. This measurement was not to really measure the situation, but rather as a tool to talk about what the figure means, or how the figure could be changed, why the figure changed, because I asked it two times. So in this longitudinal approach, this figure was an important tool to work with. So more concretely, what did the interviews reveal? On the one hand, when we look at the components the returnees talked about, these are not so different as other research. They talked about the importance of material situation, health, migration experience, the context in Georgia and Armenia, their feelings of agency, their possibility to change their situation, to see options, possibilities, to do something with their lives, their feelings of belonging, their social networks, and the importance of the reintegration support. So these were the topics they all talked about, which were, as I said, not so different as other research. But what I could see in the interviews and in analyzing the narratives is that some themes were more central. People in this context, in this reintegration situation, people really talked a lot about material situation, so housing and income, which is the same as Katie already explained. They also talked a lot about health conditions, and this relates to the context of the country of origin, where the health system is quite difficult to access, and a lot of people also migrate because of health issues. So it's logical that the health situation has a big impact post-return. They also talked a lot about feelings of agency and feelings of belonging. So actually, when we looked at changes over the 2 years period, it were these 4 domains that were really mentioned as changing the overall figure of well-being. The other domains were discussed as well, but often, for example, when you look at social network, it was very important as well. It impacted all the other domains, but it was included as it was narrated about as an impacting factor of the other 4 central domains, not as the central domain, which is very different than compared to what we learned from the presentation of Nassim, for example, which shows that there are a lot of contextual differences. The social network was not a burden to the returnees. There was not such thing as failure of migration or a price to be paid back to family members or community members. This was not an issue through its social network. If it was there, was more supportive. Of course, if there was no social network available, it highly impacted health, material situation, and feelings of belonging as well. What the research also showed is that when people talked about their overall well-being, that there were a lot of contradictions. So it was not that easy that we could sum up the situation in the material domain with feelings of belonging with the different domains. It was not that easy. People experienced a lot of contradictions, and although my material situation is very good, I feel I don't belong to my country of origin, or I really miss Belgium a lot. I really hope to be there. I want to live there, but my health is better in Armenia, so this is why I'm here. So it was a very complex narrative of the different contradictions. And when we looked at how people summarize the contradictions, we see very large individual differences there. People explaining the same contrasts can end up with a very different well-being score, showing that some people give priorities or put more value in one domain than compared to other people. So what to conclude from all of this? What is important for post-return well-being, if we compare it with previous research, this self-assessment is important. It reveals particular emphasis in their evaluation. It also shows absence of some themes, like I already explained, the failure of migration, the shame of not having succeeded abroad was not visible in this context. So it shows that there are big nuances in the uniform image we have about what is important post-return, and differences in meaning and expectations attached to migration and return play a huge role here. What our research also showed that less tangible things like feelings of agency, what probably relates to what Yajaira was explaining about psychosocial capital and feeling of belonging. These are less tangible things, but they are very important in the overall well-being of the returnees. But they are often overlooked because they are of course less easy to measure. And the contrast, I think, also show the complexity of return. We keep on saying that, but it shows that returning is something that contains elements of both hardship and satisfaction, and we really need to go in depth to understand what's happening to people. Let me then draw some final conclusions of the webinar and the special issue as a whole. So the special issue brings together different papers reflecting on the complexity of reintegration processes. And I think several contributions give very concrete empirical insight into this complexity and show how holistic approaches can be analytically realized. They also bring into attention additional components that are very central to understand reintegration processes and how you can include this in a framework that studies reintegration. So I think I will only name some, but I think several contributors have stressed the importance of the whole migration trajectory. So looking at migration motives, looking at people's aspirations, this builds, of course, on previous studies, but I think the special issue really shows how it impacts reintegration processes. Also, it clearly shows that objective and subjective types of measurement are needed and need to be combined. And it are the in-depth qualitative explorations that really show contextual differences. What we also show that what I discussed as well is that some less tangible issues are very central in reintegration processes: feelings of agency, positive psychosocial capital, positive subjective evaluations. Actually, all these terms connect and show how vital and important they are when you support people returning to the country of origin, but not as individual characteristics. These are not something to put on the returnees, but it's something that is created by their access to resources, by their experience, and by their opportunities. So I hope this special issue brings some innovative tools to study reintegration processes, and also shows that we should really go for a very nuanced understanding of forced and choice, of different analytical categories, and that return is a complex thing containing elements of both hardship and satisfaction. and impacted by many different variables. Okay, here the session or the marathon of presentations ends. Let us open the floor now to questions.
So if you're watching on YouTube, there's a chat. So please feel free to write your questions into the chat so that we can incorporate them. And if you're on the Zoom call, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly. If there's no other questions, then I guess I'm happy to jump in with some for our colleagues who presented today.
I just wanted to say no questions here now in the chat.
No, there's no questions at the moment in the chat, but I do have some questions that I can start with. So I think especially to many of our colleagues, they've been working a lot on reintegration in different contexts. And one of the things that I found quite interesting across the special issue was sort of the difference in also voluntary returns and deportations in returns and reintegration experiences. And I'm wondering if Nassim or Marie-Laurence or Tanya and Yajaira, if you guys have any comments that you would like to add on the differences you see between these two groups within your research and that you have found within the reintegration experiences in particular.
Hi, I'll go ahead and start. Thank you for the question, and what a fascinating group of papers that we have here. So our research doesn't compare deportation to voluntary return directly, but we do have a lot of people who, particularly in Brazil, that's so not in this paper, but in the broader study, who originally returned voluntarily and then and spent some time in Brazil. And then it's only when they attempted to return to the United States that they were actually deported. So they have we have some people like in one experience, they experienced voluntary return and then deportation. And at the end of the day, when they return to Brazil, the conditions are the same. I think some of the differences that we see is that, first of all, deportation is psychologically damaging, right? It's in our experience anyway. I know some of you mentioned that it may sort of be wanted, but in our experience, people did not like being deported. They felt it took away from their agency, their ability to make their own decisions in life about what they wanted to do. And even people who maybe planned to return like a month later that were deported a month earlier, right? So for them, deportation was psychologically damaging. So people don't want to be deported in our experience. And then when people do voluntarily return, in our experience, most of the time they did that with planning. They sold their assets, they had a plan of where they would go, et cetera. And deportation, at least from the United States, doesn't work like that. You don't know if you're going to be deported today or in 30 days or in 60 days. So it really complicates people's ability to plan. So in that way, it affects even though they're reintegrating into the same place with the same economic conditions, their own psychological disposition, as well as their own inability or ability to plan, makes a big difference in terms of deportation versus voluntary return.
Yeah, and I think I'll follow up on that. And And to answer your question, Katie, to say that, again, I think the Afghan context is also quite specific in terms of what we really mean when we talk about voluntariness. There's definitely a spectrum, and people who decide to return on their own after a negative decision, or in the paper, I also mentioned the case of Afghans who return because of reasons related to their families asking them to return when there's a specific incident or specific reason why the migrant who's sometimes the head of household needs to return. So there are also voluntary return decisions taken as a result. But in both cases, I think what ends up happening and what I conclude the paper on is whether it's voluntary or forced, the lack of preparation is common to both settings. So as we all know, without that level of preparedness, transnational preparation, then again, it's very hard to link back to the community or the context that one has left. So one of the conclusions and kind of the policy implications that I included in the paper was, again, we need to get policymakers and institutions who are facilitating returns to really understand this transnational relationship that needs to be built from the moment the decision is taken to return to the moment of return. So this transnational programming planning that I know many of us have been including in our recommendations and in our conclusions, but still in practice we don't see that level of transnational planning happening or of preparation happening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nassim. I just want to say that all participants, you can also write your question in the chat if you have a question that you want to raise. I would have a question to Yajaira or Tanya as well. I see that in my research that belonging, and maybe it links to Nassim, her work as well, that belonging is so important that if people feel they belong to the country of origin, which is created by social ties, of course, or by childhood memories or by strong connections, that if they have this strong feeling of belonging, that doesn't change over the years, and it strongly overshadows positively difficulties in other domains. So difficulties in material situation can be overshadowed positively by belonging, but also non-belonging is very strong if they don't want to be in the country anymore because they feel betrayed or mistreated by the country itself. This is a very, very strong sentiment. And it interconnects with social network. I wonder how that happens in the situation of the Dominican Republic, where the social network is not there, but you still talk about the strong psychosocial capital. How does that relate to feelings of belonging, or they do have a strong feeling of belonging to the country? And also in Afghanistan, maybe I have no idea how it works over there.
Okay, I will just like to say that Dominican deportees, they have been spending most of their lives in the USA. And I think some of them are clear saying, I am American, even when they are back in the Dominican Republic, and they have these, they make lots of comments, or in their testimonies, they said how they can see the difference between being in the Dominican Republic and what is life, the style of life in the USA. There's is something that they said that they miss a lot. So even though that doesn't make them to accept the reality to be deported and try to make a new life, because let's remember that the Dominican Republic as an island is more difficult for them to go back to the United States. So some of them attempt to go back, but it's almost impossible. It's very difficult for them. So I think that the resilience, that's why it's so important. And as you said, it's very difficult to measure psychological capital, resilience, but at the end, even all this adversity that they face, that they don't have their families, they don't have a proper job, at some point, they decided to start a new life with these few resources, and it's where the positive psychological capital is so important. In the case of the Dominican deportees, they don't have families, they don't have jobs, but still they start a new life, even they don't have the sense of belonging at the beginning. So, and I am going to let Tanya also explain a little bit this dimension.
Yeah, thanks. I think we have some other questions, so let's take those. I think Yajaira, you did a great job explaining what we found.
Yeah, okay. And maybe the speakers, when answering, can turn on the video. I'm sorry, I was reading the question in the meantime. So, Marie-Laurence, can you raise your question, please?
Yes, I had a question for the other presenters. I am just a bit curious. I would like to know what next steps they have in mind based on the research they presented. Do they want to go further? What do they want to investigate next?
Thank you for that question, Marie-Laurence, and thanks for your presentation. It's also super interesting. So when Yajaira and I did our research we actually interviewed 150 deportees in 4 different countries. We closed out that project a little while ago. One of the things that we found is that people would talk a lot about the difficult experiences that their family members would have when they were left behind here in the United States. Another thing that they would talk about was how many of them were funneled into prison prior to deportation as youth. So that has actually led to a new research project that we have, which looks at the family members of incarcerated people here in the United States and of deported people. So Yajaira is actually finishing up her dissertation on this topic. She's conducted, the team has conducted over 100 interviews with people who have experienced either the deportation or the incarceration of a family member. So now we're looking at how forced return migration affects people who are still living in the United States. And one of the things that we found is that it doesn't just affect the children or the partner, but it affects the cousins and the aunts and the entire extended family. So look out for that. That's Yajaira's next research project.
Yeah, to answer that question of Marie-Laurence, I think research, we have a lot of research continuing on this topic, but mainly also on the impact on the community. What does the community itself considers? How does the community members themselves consider the impact of the returnees to be? How do they see them? How do they treat them? What do they expect from them? So really, like Nassim's research, really focusing on the community level and really what it means for communities if returnees return and how do they deal with that, and also really the focus on bringing in the perspective of the country of return and not only seeing this from what is too often happening from an EU perspective and an EU policy perspective, but what is happening in the countries of return and how do they look at return reintegration and how they want to deal with it. Nassim?
Yeah, and just following up on that exactly, going further into the community, at the community level, the follow-up work we're doing now is around the gender dimension, so women's perspective of what the migration process was like for them being left behind. And I do not like this term, and if any of you have a better term than women left behind, do let me know. But working on the gender dimension of this, of reintegration as well, what the departure, the absence, and the return implies for women, and their role economically, socially, culturally. And the other perspective on the demographic scale is looking at implications for children. So we're doing quite a bit of research now, and we started a couple of years ago on children's experiences of reintegration as well. So looking further into the household level, community level dynamics from a demographic perspective.
Well, I think it's super interesting, and I think it's not the last time that we will meet and maybe collaborate together, because I also have that kind of research question in mind. I'm also interested in how migration policies and populations affect the families.
Yeah, I've always dreamed of working with you, so there you go. If that can be it, then great.
Yeah, thanks for this. Maybe we take another question from the chat. Yulin, you can raise your question.
Yes. Yes, thank you for the presentations. They were very interesting. I was actually wondering about, there were several of the presenters who addressed issues of social integration and the importance of social networks upon return. And I was wondering, because there was also the concept of community, also questions, for example, in the case of Afghanistan, I think. But I was also wondering how, because like before return, I was wondering how the returnees, if they still like, if they still have like, if they still connect to the people in the country from which they were deported, or the countries from which they had to return. Because like, for example, in the case of Dominican Republic, I think I understood that they spent an average time of 16 years in the US before returning, if that was correct. So I was wondering if like, how do people still like keep in touch with the people they left behind in the country from which they had to be deported? Did they have a network there? Like, does this network then also able to constitute a valuable network, like a lasting or durable network that can also be used upon return or not? Because you often like see that when people migrate to countries, they also often send back money. And when migrants have to return, their families also expect some support. So it's like, how does this, I don't know, social network, the country they left behind, like, how does it still exist, or like, does it still work, or what kind of value does it have? So it's not like directed at one specific person, but several of you have addressed this, and I would be very interested to know, I mean, what you think about this.
Okay, I can start just to mention very quick that these transnational relations for Dominicans, of course, implies lots of not only emotional, but financial burdens, because sometimes they rely on, since they are not able to find a job very quick, sometimes they rely on remittances that family members send from the USA to the Dominican Republic. So it implies a financial burden, but they communicate even over the time. As we said, in average, they have been spending 16 years in the USA, but some of them immigrated when they were very young, even when they were babies. So some of them even spent 30, 40 years in the United States before deportation, but still they continue these relations. One issue that we find is how, for example, after 10 years of being deported, or even 5, they start to build new relationships in the Dominican Republic, and it becomes in a conflict with the family in the USA, because then the wife of the children, they are like, but you have already another family in the Dominican Republic. So there are many family issues going on for deportees. And I think is how we can understand that for deportees, they have so many issues going on. They don't they have to deal with the families in the USA, but also with the families, the new families that they build in the Dominican Republic. So I think these transnational relationships can drain them emotionally a lot, and also it implies, like, as I said, financial burdens for them. Yeah. I don't know if Tanya wants to add something to the case of the Dominican Republic.
I think that's, I think that's what I would say too. And just keep in mind that these transnational ties are gendered. So even if, when most of the deportees in Dominican Republic are men, over 90%. So when they're maintaining these relationships back in the United States, even though they rarely can support their families financially, they feel like they should be. So this sort of complicated relationship. They accept the money when they need it, but they feel very bad about it because of their gendered expectations about the role they should be playing in their family.
Okay, thanks a lot for all these answers. I just wanted to to collect the final questions that have been posted in the chat. Let me have a look. So there is one question specifically for Marie-Laurence asking about the mobility possibility or the mobility freedom, that it was important for returnees in Senegal. But if you could explain this a bit more, and if mobility freedom is important in other contexts too. We had another question on how migration processes impact reintegration of the migrants. So if the migration process or the migration experience is negative, is it then more likely that migrants will decide to migrate again and decide not to stay in the home country? That's a second question. And then we have a couple of questions. Are there any examples of the importance of family mediations to make reintegration possible? And if any research sees the impact of returnees' level of education on their reintegration? And there was a final question on when this special issue is going to be available. I can answer this immediately now. 5 of the 6 papers are online already in international migration for online preview, so that you can consult them already. We wait for the 6th paper, and then the collective will appear as a whole together with an editorial bringing together the different insights of the different papers. So it's still waiting a bit for the 6th paper, and then it can be published as a whole. Okay, a lot of questions. I don't know who from the presenters wants to start.
The question on how the possibility to migrate again is important for returnees. Actually, this is what I showed for Senegal and Congo, but actually I think the question is the person wants to know whether it's also important in the other context, in the other papers. Well, so I don't want to answer that. But I think the answers to answer the other question are quite long, but of course the migration process impacts the reintegration, because this is during the migration process, people have in mind what they want, how they see the future, so their aspirations are very important. They anticipate the future, and so according to that they prepare, and it will impact their integration. Yes. Well, I will leave the floor to somebody else, maybe.
Thanks, Marie-Laurence. I can take some answers, some questions as well. I think the importance of the opportunity to be the freedom of mobility, it depends a bit on the geographical distance. Mm-hmm. If the further you go, the further that the distance is, and the harder it is to be mobile between 2 locations, the more important it is to have this freedom of mobility, to secure that you can go back before before you are returned. So I think if you see return in European contexts or geographical locations that are quite close by, that might be less important because people can more easily return, even though it remains costly, of course. And the question about family mediation, I haven't researched family mediation in the reintegration process, but we see that family mediation is also needed or important before the decision to return. So that it's important that the return is negotiated with the families before returnees go back, certainly in the West African context. If this is not done or not possible because of deportations, it's harder upon return to reconnect and to balance expectations of the family.
And also maybe just offer a comment in the case of that relates to some of the questions posed. So I think if the migration process was negative, will they still decide to migrate again or stay in the home country? Definitely in Ethiopia, we've seen that despite very negative migration experiences, people will decide to migrate again. And this is generally because they're just not able to create the conditions to be able to stay in Ethiopia. Their families are often reliant on the incomes that they're generating. So they feel, even if they've had very negative experiences of abuse, that they need to migrate again to support the family and to make that income. And I think also then going to the question of Sabina, in our study, we did look at the education. We can say that in one of our initial models, education was significant, that respondents who had a higher level of education were more likely to evaluate their return positively, but this wasn't significant in the final result. So I think that more work would be needed in that area. And there was a final question that was also added in terms of the level of employment, if this also had an impact on the reintegration. And in Ethiopia, I can say that people who were employed with an actual employment position in the survey was only 5%. And those people were more likely to have a positive evaluation of the return because they had a full employment position. But it was very, very low levels. And that was a major issue, I think, in terms of the reintegration processes overall. Thanks. I think, Nassim, then you wanted to also just jump in with some comments.
No, I think there's always one sentence that I remember from Lisa Schuster's work on deportations to Afghanistan is basically that it's likely that those whose migration process was negative and their return process was negative will migrate again, very simply because, as she would put it, the reasons for the initial migration remain unchanged. So I think that's where you should be looking at in terms of the research, is whether the initial reasons for migration remain, and usually yes. So whether the migration process or return process was negative, that's enough to motivate and justify remigration.
Okay, thanks a lot. I hope this solves already some of the questions. I want to thank all presenters at first for their input and for all the work on the special issue and for the webinar as well, of course, and all the participants for being here, for asking questions. Thanks a lot. I think you can always contact us if there are further questions or you have questions about the special issue. And if there are no questions, urgent questions at this moment, we will close this session for now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.